The concrete floor of the garage was so cold that night that Margaret Doyle could feel it through 2 blankets and a sleeping bag, seeping up into her bones like something trying to remind her exactly how little she was worth to the man sleeping warm in the bedroom upstairs. She had asked him quietly if she could just sleep on the living room couch instead. He'd said no. He said the couch was for guests, and guests, unlike her, still mattered in that house. What Roland Doyle did not know, lying in their bed that night without a single thought for his wife shivering 40 feet away on a garage floor, was that 6 days earlier, an attorney in Savannah had left 3 voicemails Margaret still hadn't found the courage to return, each one beginning with the same 7 words. "Mrs. Doyle, this concerns your late aunt's estate." He had no idea that his quiet, uncomplaining wife of 19 years was, at that exact moment, the newly named sole heir to a $500 million family trust she hadn't even known existed until the week before, and that within 11 days, he would be standing in a driveway watching moving trucks carry away a life he'd never once bothered to actually value. This is the story of the coldest night of Margaret Doyle's marriage, and the astonishing quiet reckoning that followed it. Margaret Ellen Whitfield had grown up in a modest 2-story house in Macon, Georgia, the younger of 2 daughters born to a schoolteacher father and a mother who worked the front desk at a regional bank. Her childhood had been unremarkable in the best possible sense, full of church potlucks and library summer reading programs and the particular, steady warmth of parents who loved their daughters without ever once making that love feel conditional on achievement or beauty or ambition. What Margaret didn't know, growing up in that unremarkable house, was that her father's older sister, a woman named Constance Whitfield Pruitt, had left the family behind at 19 years old to marry into an old Savannah shipping and real estate fortune, and had spent the following 5 decades quietly, deliberately estranged from her Macon relatives, following a bitter falling out with her own father over the marriage nobody in the family had approved of. Constance had married well, buried 2 husbands, outlived both of her own children, and had, by the final years of her life, become the kind of distant, half-mythical relative that families mention only occasionally at holidays, in the tone people use for someone who might as well be a stranger. Margaret had met her exactly once, at 11 years old, at her grandfather's funeral, and remembered nothing about the encounter except a woman in an enormous black hat who had pressed a peppermint candy into her palm and told her, in a voice like dry paper, that she had her grandmother's eyes. Margaret had no idea, all those years later, sitting in a garage with a concrete floor beneath her, that this same distant great-aunt, dying alone in a Savannah mansion at 91 years old with no surviving children and a decades-long grudge she'd apparently softened toward at the very end of her life, had spent her final 18 months quietly instructing her attorneys to locate her only remaining Whitfield blood relative and rewrite her entire estate plan around her. Margaret met Roland Doyle at 24, 3 years after finishing a business administration degree she'd never gotten much use out of, at a friend's backyard barbecue in Macon. Roland was handsome in an assured, easy way, 28 years old, working then as a junior sales representative for a regional building supply company, full of confident talk about the empire he was going to build someday. Margaret, quiet by temperament, gentle in the way her mother had always been gentle, found something magnetic in his certainty. She married him 14 months later in a small church wedding neither family could afford to make especially grand. For the first several years the marriage had been, if not effortless, at least kind. Roland worked long hours climbing the ranks of the building supply company, eventually striking out with 2 partners to found his own regional construction materials distributor, a business that grew steadily, then rapidly, over the following decade, until Doyle Brothers Supply had 4 warehouses across 3 counties and Roland Doyle had become, in his own mind at least, a genuinely important man in the world of Central Georgia commerce. Margaret had no idea, in those early years of quiet devotion, exactly how thoroughly her husband's growing success would eventually curdle into the specific, corrosive contempt that would define the final stretch of their marriage. The shift, when Margaret looked back on it later with the clarity that only comes after something finally breaks completely, hadn't happened all at once. It had happened the way most quiet cruelties happen, in small, deniable increments that each seemed too minor to fight over individually, until one day she looked up and realized the entire shape of her marriage had changed around her without her ever agreeing to it. Roland started, somewhere around their 12th year of marriage, referring to Margaret's contributions to the household in the language of expense rather than partnership. He complained in front of other people about how much her modest wardrobe cost, even though she rarely bought anything for herself at all. He stopped inviting her to business dinners with his growing circle of contractor friends and county commissioners, telling her the first few times that she'd be bored, and eventually not bothering to explain at all. He began comparing her, not always subtly, to the wives of his business partners, women who golfed and lunched and wore the specific, visible markers of a certain kind of prosperity Margaret had never cared to chase. "You've let yourself become invisible, Margaret," he told her once at their 15th anniversary dinner, a comment she'd absorbed with the particular, practiced stillness she'd learned to bring to most of his criticisms by then. "I built something. You could at least try to look like you belong next to it." She had no idea, sitting across from him at that anniversary dinner, swallowing the comment along with her food, that Roland's growing contempt for her quiet, unremarkable presence was being fed, in no small part, by a specific person he'd started spending considerably more time with over the previous year, a business consultant named Priscilla Vance who'd been brought in to help modernize Doyle Brothers Supplies operations and who had, according to details Margaret would only fully piece together much later, begun quietly encouraging Roland's growing sense that he'd married beneath the life he now deserved. The final 2 years of the marriage settled into a pattern Margaret recognized, even at the time, as something closer to tenancy than partnership. Roland traveled frequently for business, often staying away longer than his stated meetings required. He grew short-tempered at home, dismissive of her opinions, openly irritated by her presence in rooms he'd apparently begun considering exclusively his own. He started sleeping in the guest bedroom 2 nights a week, then 3, citing his snoring, his early mornings, his need for undisturbed sleep, explanations Margaret accepted with the same quiet, weary patience she'd brought to nearly everything in that marriage for almost 2 decades. She had no idea, enduring those slow, grinding humiliations one at a time, that the very worst of them was still waiting for her. On an unremarkable Tuesday night in late October, 6 days after an attorney in Savannah had first tried to reach her. The night it happened began with something almost absurdly small. Margaret had left a load of laundry running past 10 o'clock, and the dryer, situated in the garage beside Roland's newly purchased truck, had apparently disturbed him enough that he'd come downstairs in his robe, furious in a way that seemed, even to Margaret in the moment, disproportionate to the actual offense. "I have an early meeting with the county commissioners tomorrow," he said, standing in the kitchen doorway with an expression she'd started to recognize as his particular brand of controlled rage, the kind that never quite raised its voice but somehow felt more frightening for its coldness. "I need actual sleep, Margaret. Not this. Not you clattering around at all hours like you don't have a single consideration for what my life actually requires." Margaret had apologized, had gone to shut off the dryer, had tried, gently, to explain that she'd simply lost track of the hour reading in the den. Roland hadn't wanted the explanation. He'd wanted, she understood later, an outlet for something that had been building in him for weeks, something that had very little to do with a load of laundry at all. "I can't sleep with you in that bed tonight," he said, and something in his voice had gone flat and final in a way that made Margaret's stomach drop before she even fully understood what he meant. "Sleep somewhere else. I don't care where. The garage has a space heater. Use it." Margaret had stood in the kitchen for a long moment, certain, in that first disoriented second, that she'd misheard him. "Roland, it's 40 degrees outside tonight." "Then bundle up," he said, already turning to walk back up the stairs. "I need my rest, Margaret. I'm not asking again." She had no idea, standing alone in that kitchen at nearly 11 o'clock at night, that this single moment, this exact cruel demand that she remove herself from her own bedroom into a cold concrete garage rather than disturb her husband's sleep, was about to become the specific memory that finally, completely severed whatever remained of her willingness to keep absorbing his contempt without protest. She hadn't fought him. That wasn't in her nature, not after 19 years of learning, slowly and painfully, that fighting Roland rarely produced anything except a longer, colder argument that ended the same way regardless. She had gathered 2 blankets, an old sleeping bag from a camping trip they'd taken years earlier when the marriage still felt like something worth camping for, and had walked out to the garage, dragging a folding cot from beside the water heater and setting it up in the small clear space beside Roland's truck. The space heater had done little against the concrete cold seeping up from the floor. Margaret had lain awake for hours that night, staring at the ceiling of a garage that smelled like motor oil and cut grass, feeling something inside her chest that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite rage but sat somewhere uncomfortably between the two. a feeling she would later come to recognize as the specific, quiet moment a person finally, fully understands they deserve better than what they've been accepting. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, unable to sleep, Margaret had reached for her phone, scrolling without much purpose through old messages and forgotten notifications, and had finally, for the first time in 6 days, opened the voicemail she'd been avoiding from a Savannah phone number she didn't recognize. Mrs. Doyle, this is Harlan Beckett with Beckett, Marsh & Coyle. This concerns your late aunt's estate. Please return my call at your earliest convenience. It is, I promise you, considerably urgent. Margaret had stared at her phone in the dark, cold garage, genuinely confused. She had no aunt she was aware of, certainly no aunt whose estate would require an attorney's urgent voicemail. She'd assumed on some level that it must be a mistake, a wrong number, a scam of some kind targeting the elderly or the confused. But something in the attorney's voice, the specific formal gravity of it, had lodged itself in her mind, and she'd found herself, cold and sleepless on a garage cot, dialing the number back at nearly 3 o'clock in the morning, more out of a desperate need for something to occupy her mind than any real expectation the call would matter. The voicemail box had picked up, naturally, at that hour, but she'd left a message anyway, her voice quiet in the dark garage so as not to wake the husband who'd exiled her there. This is Margaret Doyle. I'm returning your call about my aunt's estate. I'm not sure I understand who you mean, but please call me back. She had no idea, hanging up that phone in the freezing dark of her own garage, that Harlan Beckett would call her back at exactly 9 the next morning, and that the conversation that followed would begin the process of completely, irreversibly rewriting the rest of her life. Harlan Beckett's voice, when he called the following morning while Margaret sat in her car in a grocery store parking lot, hands trembling slightly around her phone, carried the particular measured formality of a man who had delivered enormous news to enormous numbers of stunned people over a long career and had learned, somewhere along the way, exactly how to pace such conversations. Mrs. Doyle, thank you for returning my call. I represent the estate of your great-aunt, Constance Whitfield Pruitt, who passed away 3 weeks ago in Savannah. I understand you may not have known her well, but I need to inform you that you have been named the sole beneficiary of her estate. Margaret had gripped the steering wheel, genuinely uncertain she'd heard him correctly. I'm sorry, I think there's been some confusion. I barely knew her. I met her once when I was a child. There's no confusion, Mrs. Doyle, Harlan said gently. Mrs. Pruitt spent the final year and a half of her life working directly with our firm to restructure her estate plan specifically around locating you. She had no surviving children, and after her falling out with your grandfather decades ago, she had, by her own account, spent many years regretting the distance it created with the rest of the family. She wanted, in her words, to make something right before she passed. Margaret's breath had caught somewhere in her throat. Make what right, exactly? Harlan had paused, the particular deliberate pause of a man about to say something that would change the entire shape of the conversation. Mrs. Doyle, the estate, including the Pruitt family's real estate holdings, the shipping and logistics company her second husband built, and a diversified investment portfolio managed over 5 decades, is valued, as of last quarter's audit, at approximately $512 million. All of it, Mrs. Doyle, passes to you. Margaret had sat frozen in her car for what felt like a very long time after that call ended, staring through the windshield at nothing in particular, absorbing a piece of information so enormous it seemed to refuse to fully land in her mind all at once. She had no idea, sitting in that grocery store parking lot with her entire understanding of her own life quietly rearranging itself, that she would spend the following several days in a strange, suspended state of secrecy, not from any grand strategic plan, but simply because she genuinely did not know, yet, what to do with information this large, or how to say it out loud to a husband who, only hours earlier, had made her sleep on a concrete floor rather than disturb his rest. The days that followed unfolded with a quiet, surreal duality that Margaret found almost impossible to fully process. By day, she drove to Savannah twice, meeting with Harlan Beckett and a small team of estate attorneys and financial advisors who walked her, patiently and in careful detail, through the full scope of what she'd inherited. The Pruitt Logistics Company, a mid-sized but highly profitable shipping and freight operation with facilities across the Southeast. A portfolio of commercial real estate holdings in Savannah's historic district, largely untouched by decades of development pressure specifically because Constance had refused every offer to sell. a diversified investment account managed conservatively, but effectively for over 30 years. And the mansion itself, a restored antebellum property on Savannah's most prestigious residential square. Fully furnished, fully paid, sitting empty since Constance's death. By night, she returned home to Roland, who noticed, if he noticed anything at all during those strange days, only that his wife seemed unusually quiet, unusually distracted, a change he attributed, when he bothered to attribute it to anything, to what he assumed was lingering resentment over the garage, resentment he considered, based on comments he made twice that week, to be somewhat dramatic given the minor nature of the original disagreement. "You're being awfully sensitive about one night on a cot," he told her on the fourth day, not looking up from his phone at the dinner table. "It's not like I made you sleep outside." Margaret had said nothing, cutting her food with the same quiet, practiced calm she brought to nearly every dinner of the past several years, thinking, in a part of her mind Roland had no access to at all, about a mansion on a Savannah square with her name now on the deed, and a shipping company employing over 400 people that she now held controlling interest in, and a decision still forming about exactly how and when she would tell him any of it. She had no idea, sitting across from him at that dinner table absorbing his casual dismissal of the garage, that the answer to that question was about to arrive considerably sooner than she'd planned, and in a form Roland himself would end up choosing entirely without meaning to. The moment came 6 days after Margaret first learned about the inheritance, on a Saturday afternoon when Roland, apparently emboldened by what he perceived as his wife's continued docility, decided the time had come to address something he'd apparently been quietly considering for months. "I think we need to talk about some changes," he said, settling across from her at the kitchen table with the specific, businesslike posture he brought to negotiations at work, a posture Margaret recognized immediately and understood, with a sinking clarity, meant he had prepared something. "What kind of changes?" she asked carefully. "I've been thinking about the house," Roland said. "About us, really. Margaret, I think it's time we consider a formal separation. I've spoken with an attorney. I want to be upfront about that. I think, given how things have been between us, it's the right move for both of us." Margaret sat very still, absorbing the specific, clinical cruelty of a husband who had apparently spent recent weeks consulting a divorce attorney while simultaneously exiling her to a garage floor for the crime of running a dryer too late at night. "You've already spoken to an attorney. I think it's best if we're both practical about this," Roland continued, sliding a folded document across the table with a confidence that revealed, more clearly than anything he'd said in years, exactly how little he had ever actually considered his wife a person capable of surprising him. "I had my lawyer draft something reasonable. Given that the house and the business are both in my name, and given that you haven't worked in years, I think you'll find the terms are more than fair." Margaret looked down at the document without touching it. She thought, in that moment, about Harlan Beckett's careful voice explaining the scope of the Pruitt estate. She thought about the garage floor, cold and unforgiving beneath 2 blankets. She thought about 19 years of quiet accommodation finally arriving at exactly this moment. A man sliding divorce papers across a kitchen table with the same casual confidence he'd once used to send her to sleep on concrete. "Roland," she said, her voice steady in a way that seemed to genuinely startle him, "before we discuss your papers, I think there's something you should know." He looked up, mild irritation flickering across his face at the interruption. "What is it, Margaret?" "6 days ago, I inherited my great-aunt's estate," she said simply. "The full estate. All of it. It's worth, as of the most recent valuation, a little over $500 million. Roland's expression didn't shift immediately, the way a person's expression sometimes takes a full second or two to catch up to information too large for it to process on the first pass. "I'm sorry, what?" "I own a shipping and logistics company now," Margaret continued, her voice remaining calm, almost gentle, the way she might explain something to a confused child. "I own a mansion in Savannah. I own commercial real estate across the historic district. I have lawyers, Roland. I've had them for 6 days. I just didn't know how to tell you, because I genuinely wasn't sure it would matter to you at all, given everything else." She had no idea, watching her husband's face slowly visibly drain of the confident color it had carried into that conversation, that this single quiet sentence, delivered without a hint of triumph or cruelty, was about to become the exact moment Roland Doyle understood, far too late, Exactly what he had spent the last several years of his marriage carelessly discarding. Roland stared at the folded divorce papers still sitting on the table between them, and Margaret watched something complicated move across his face: disbelief, then a flicker of something that looked almost like calculation, then, finally, a kind of stammering backpedaling that revealed more about his character in 30 seconds than 19 years of marriage had fully clarified. "Margaret, I had no idea," he said, reaching for the papers as though he might physically take them back off the table. "Obviously we don't need to rush into anything. I think we should talk about this properly, take some time." "You wanted to talk properly a moment ago too," Margaret said, still calm, still measured. "You had an attorney draft papers, Roland. You were prepared to give me, what does it say here, $12,000 and the used sedan." Roland's jaw tightened. "That was before I knew about any of this." "I know," Margaret said quietly, and something in the simple, plain honesty of those two words seemed to land harder than any accusation could have. "That's rather the point, isn't it?" She had no idea, standing up from that kitchen table and walking calmly toward the stairs, leaving Roland sitting alone with his now worthless divorce papers, that the following 11 days would unfold with a swiftness that would leave him scrambling to reverse a decision he'd made with total confidence, never once imagining the woman across the table held any leverage at all. Margaret spent that evening on the phone with Harlan Beckett, not to discuss the marriage directly, but to ask a question that had been quietly forming in her mind since the moment Roland's divorce papers hit the kitchen table. "Harlan, if I wanted to move forward with the estate now, live in the Savannah house, take over active oversight of the company, what would that actually look like practically?" "It would look like whatever you want it to look like, Mrs. Doyle," Harlan told her. "You have complete discretion. Mrs. Pruitt structured the trust specifically to give you total control, unencumbered by anyone else's claim, present or future." Margaret had absorbed that phrase carefully. Unencumbered by anyone else's claim. Her great-aunt, a woman she'd met exactly once at 11 years old, had apparently anticipated in some quiet, careful way exactly the kind of situation Margaret now found herself in, and had built protections into the trust that ensured none of it could ever be touched by a husband who had, until 6 days ago, no idea it existed at all. Over the following days, Roland's behavior shifted with a speed that Margaret found almost darkly fascinating to observe from the strange, detached distance she now found herself occupying in her own marriage. The man who had exiled her to a garage floor for a late-running dryer suddenly seemed unable to do enough for her. He cooked dinner, an act Margaret genuinely could not remember him performing in over a decade of marriage. He canceled a business trip to stay home with her. He brought home flowers twice with a clumsy, transparent eagerness that made Margaret's chest ache with something that felt less like affection and more like a very specific, very late form of grief for the marriage she'd once genuinely believed they were building together. "I've been thinking," Roland said one evening, for days after the revelation, sitting across from her with a carefully rehearsed gentleness in his voice, "maybe we should think about the divorce papers differently. Maybe there's a version of this where we work through things together as partners." Margaret had looked at him for a long moment, genuinely considering, for the first time since the garage, whether any real part of him actually meant what he was saying, or whether this was simply the same calculating instinct that had built his business, now redirected entirely toward a $500 million redirection of his own future. "Roland," she finally said, "I want to ask you something honestly, and I want you to actually think before you answer. If I called Harlan Beckett tomorrow and told him the inheritance had fallen through, that there'd been some legal complication and none of it was actually mine, would you still want to work through things together?" The silence that followed her question lasted long enough to answer it completely. Roland's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, searching visibly for a response that could somehow salvage the moment, and finding in the end, nothing that didn't sound exactly as hollow as the truth underneath it. "That's not fair, Margaret," he finally said. "That's a completely different situation." "It's the same situation," she said quietly. "It's simply the one with the inheritance removed. And I think, Roland, that the fact you can't answer that question honestly tells me everything I actually need to know." She had no idea, standing up from that conversation and walking calmly toward the guest bedroom, the same room Roland had so often retreated to over recent years, that she was about to spend her final night in that house not out of exile, but out of her own entirely deliberate choice, and that by morning the shape of her life would have already begun its final, decisive turn away from the man sitting alone at the kitchen table. Margaret called Harlan Beckett the following morning and told him she was ready to move forward, fully and formally, with taking active possession of the Savannah estate. She retained a family law attorney of her own that same week, a sharp, unhurried woman named Ottilie Vance, who reviewed Roland's original divorce papers with an expression that shifted, over the course of the meeting, from professional neutrality into something closer to quiet, controlled outrage. "He offered you $12,000 and a used sedan after 19 years of marriage," Ottilie said, sliding the original document back across her desk. "Mrs. Doyle, I want to be direct with you. Georgia is an equitable distribution state. The business he built during your marriage, the house, the retirement accounts, all of it is subject to fair division regardless of whose name appears on the paperwork. He drafted these papers assuming you had no leverage and no understanding of your own rights. That assumption was, to put it generously, a significant miscalculation on his part." Margaret had listened carefully, absorbing information about her own legal position that she genuinely hadn't understood before, information Roland himself, with his years of business experience and his casual confidence in dictating the terms of their separation, had apparently also failed to fully calculate before sliding those papers across the kitchen table. "I don't actually want to take everything from him," Margaret said carefully. "I'm not interested in destroying him financially out of spite. I simply want what's fair, and I want it handled properly, without him assuming he can dictate the terms the way he tried to before he knew anything had changed." Ottilie had nodded, respect visible in her expression. "That's precisely the approach that will serve you best, Mrs. Doyle. Fairness delivered with documentation is far more powerful than revenge delivered with anger." The formal divorce proceedings, once properly filed with Margaret's own attorney representing her interests, moved with a swiftness that left Roland visibly unmoored, a man accustomed to being the party who controlled the pace and terms of every negotiation in his life, suddenly finding himself reacting rather than directing. Doyle Brothers Supply, it turned out, carried considerably more debt than Roland had ever disclosed to Margaret across their marriage, debt that had been quietly accumulated over the previous 3 years as he expanded aggressively into markets that hadn't yet proven profitable. The business, once properly valued during the divorce proceedings, was worth considerably less than Roland's confident public persona had always suggested, a discovery that seemed to genuinely surprise even him when Ottilie's forensic accountant walked through the numbers during a deposition. Margaret ultimately received, through the settlement, half the marital value of the house, a portion of Roland's retirement accounts accumulated during their marriage, and at her own explicit insistence against Ottilie's initial recommendation to pursue more, nothing whatsoever tied to Doyle Brothers Supply itself, a business she genuinely had no interest in owning or controlling. "I don't need his business," she told Ottilie during their final settlement meeting. "I have my own now. A considerably larger one, as it happens." 11 days after Roland Doyle had confidently slid divorce papers across a kitchen table, certain he was ending a marriage on his own carefully calculated terms, he stood instead in the driveway of the house they'd shared for over a decade, watching a moving truck load the last of Margaret's boxes, a woman he had once made sleep on a garage floor now driving away toward a mansion in Savannah he would never once set foot inside. "Margaret," he said, one last time as she settled into the driver's seat of her car, "I know I made mistakes. I know I didn't see you the way I should have. Doesn't that count for something?" Margaret looked at him for a long moment through the open car window, feeling, to her own quiet surprise, considerably less anger than she might have expected to feel in this exact moment, replaced instead by something closer to a tired, settled clarity. "It counts for the fact that I finally understand something I should have understood years ago, Roland," she said. "You didn't see me because you never actually looked. Not once in 19 years did you look at me and wonder what I might actually be capable of. You looked at me and decided, based on nothing but your own assumptions, exactly how small I was allowed to be in your life. I hope genuinely that you learned something from this. But I'm not staying around to find out." She had no idea, driving away from that house for the final time, exactly how completely her life was about to transform over the following months, or how thoroughly the quiet, unremarkable woman Roland had once dismissed as invisible was about to become someone entirely different, in the fullest, most deliberate sense of the word. The months that followed unfolded with a quiet, steady momentum that Margaret found, to her genuine surprise, deeply satisfying in a way that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with simply, finally, building a life around her own actual capabilities rather than the shrunken, careful version of herself she'd maintained throughout her marriage. She moved into the Savannah mansion within a month of the divorce finalizing, spending her first weeks there simply walking the halls of a house that had belonged to a great-aunt she barely remembered, learning the shape of a life she hadn't known was waiting for her. She took an active role at Pruitt Logistics, not by seizing dramatic executive control, but by spending months genuinely learning the business from the ground up, sitting with warehouse managers, riding along with delivery drivers, asking careful, patient questions the way she'd once asked careful, patient questions of Roland's business partners at dinner she'd rarely been invited to. She discovered over those months a genuine talent for the work, a quiet, methodical intelligence that had simply never been given room to breathe inside her marriage. Within a year, she had restructured several of the company's least efficient regional routes, personally negotiated a significant new logistics contract with a coastal manufacturing client, and earned, from a workforce initially skeptical of an unknown heir suddenly appearing at the top of their organizational chart, a genuine, hard-won respect built entirely on her own demonstrated competence rather than her inherited last name. She also, in that first year, established the Constance Pruitt Foundation, funded through a portion of the estate's investment returns, focused specifically on supporting women rebuilding their financial independence after long marriages, offering everything from small business grants to career retraining scholarships to legal aid for women navigating divorces considerably less favorable than her own had ultimately become. "I spent 19 years being told I was invisible," Margaret said at the foundation's opening event, standing in front of a modest crowd in a converted warehouse space near the Savannah waterfront, her voice carrying none of the performative grandeur such moments sometimes invite, only a quiet, genuine steadiness. "I want this foundation to make sure other women never have to spend that long learning what I eventually learned. You are not defined by how small someone else decides you're allowed to be. You are defined by what you build once you finally stop asking their permission to be more." Roland, for his part, sold Doyle Brothers Supply 18 months after the divorce finalized, the accumulated debt from his overly aggressive expansion having finally caught up with the business in ways he couldn't outrun through confidence alone. He took a sales position with a competitor firm, considerably smaller in title and scope than the empire he'd once imagined himself building, and Margaret heard, only secondhand and without any particular interest in the details, that he'd married again within 2 years, a woman considerably younger than himself who worked as a receptionist at his new company, a detail that struck Margaret when she heard it, with nothing more than a distant, faintly wistful curiosity about whether he'd learned anything at all from the marriage he'd so carelessly discarded, or whether he was simply quietly beginning the exact same pattern all over again with someone new. She thought sometimes, in the years that followed, about that cold garage floor, the specific physical memory of concrete seeping through 2 blankets on a 40-degree October night, and understood, with the clarity that only comes from surviving something and building an entirely new life on the other side of it, that the night had actually marked 2 beginnings rather than one ending. It had been the end of 19 years spent quietly shrinking herself to fit inside someone else's careless, narrow definition of her worth. And it had been, though she couldn't have known it at the time, lying awake and cold and finally fully done, the exact beginning of everything she went on to build afterward, entirely, deliberately, unmistakably her own. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button and let me know in the comments. Do you think Margaret was too generous in the divorce settlement? Or did she handle Roland's betrayal exactly the way it deserved to be handled? Subscribe and turn on notifications, because next week we're telling the story of a groundskeeper quietly fired the same week his employer's family discovered exactly whose land their entire estate had actually been built on.